The police arrived within 20 minutes, as they always did in St. Crispin's, with the unhurried efficiency of a force accustomed to the village's most dramatic incidents being nothing more serious than a dispute over fence boundaries or the occasional bicycle theft. Inspector Calloway was a man in his 50s, competent enough in his way, though Miss Marple had observed that competence and imagination rarely traveled together, and Calloway possessed almost no imagination whatsoever. He established himself in the village hall's small office, a cramped room that smelled of old paper, and the particular mustiness that accumulated in spaces rarely used. The body of Margaret Pemberton had been carefully moved to the kitchen counter, awaiting the coroner's arrival, and Dr. Hartley had reluctantly surrendered his position as the authority in the room. This seemed to pain him considerably. Miss Marple noticed how his jaw tightened as he was politely but firmly asked to remain in the main hall with the other guests until he could be formally questioned. "Now then," Calloway said, settling into the chair behind the desk with the air of a man preparing to complete a rather tedious but necessary administrative task. "I'll need statements from everyone present. Let's begin with the family, shall we?" Eleanor Hartley was called in first. She entered the office with the careful steps of someone navigating a room they couldn't quite see, and her hands had taken on a faint tremor that she could not quite control. Miss Marple, observing from her seat in the hall, noted how Eleanor's eyes kept returning to the kitchen doorway, as if checking to confirm that the dreadful scene was still real. "Mrs. Hartley," Calloway began, consulting his notebook with the methodical air of a man following a well-worn script. "Can you tell me what your relationship was with the deceased?" "Margaret Pemberton was a long-time member of our community," Eleanor replied, her voice carefully measured. "We were not particularly close, but we knew each other as one does in a village of this size." "And when did you last see her alive?" Eleanor paused, considering. "Perhaps an hour before she was found. She arrived at the festival shortly after it began. She seemed in a mood. Difficult, as she often was." "Difficult in what way?" "Margaret was always complaining about something," Eleanor said, and now there was the faintest edge of irritation in her voice. "She disapproved of the flower arrangements. She said the dahlias were too ostentatious, that they lacked the proper restraint of traditional English gardening. She was a woman who seemed to find fault with nearly everything." This was accurate, Miss Marple reflected. Margaret Pemberton had been precisely the sort of elderly widow who had converted her grief and disappointment into a kind of professional grievance-making. She had opinions on everything, and most of them were negative. "Did anyone else speak to her before her death?" Calloway asked. "Victoria Chen, I believe, brought her some tea not long before she was found in the kitchen." Calloway made a note. "The nurse, yes. Dr. Hartley's employee." Eleanor's expression flickered. Just for a moment, but Miss Marple caught it. There was something there, some reaction that went beyond the natural consternation one might feel at the mention of a colleague. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly, "though I'm not certain Victoria knew Margaret particularly well." When Eleanor was dismissed, Victoria Chen was called in next. She was a composed young woman of perhaps 30, with the kind of calm efficiency that came from years of nursing work. She answered Calloway's questions directly and without embellishment, explaining that she had indeed brought Mrs. Pemberton a cup of tea at the deceased's request, that Margaret had seemed in her usual irritable humor, and that Victoria had left her in the kitchen not more than 10 minutes before discovering her collapsed on the floor. "Did you notice anything unusual about Mrs. Pemberton's condition?" Calloway asked. "She seemed tired," Victoria said thoughtfully. "Her speech was perhaps slightly slurred, though I attributed that to her age. She was 74 after all." Miss Marple filed away this detail, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone being examined in sunlight. Over the next hour, Calloway worked through his list of guests methodically. The vicar, Reverend Thomas, confirmed that Margaret had indeed been present and had indeed seemed her usual acerbic self. The shopkeeper, Mr. Finch, mentioned that Margaret had complained to him about the quality of the refreshments. A dozen other villagers provided similar testimony, painting a picture of Margaret Pemberton as a woman unremarkable in her death, because she had been so decidedly unremarkable and unpleasant in her life, but Miss Marple noticed what others did not. She noted the careful distance that seemed to exist between Eleanor and Victoria, the way they made a deliberate show of not looking at each other. She observed that Dr. Hartley's concern, though professionally expressed, seemed somewhat muted, as though he were performing the role of grieving community member rather than genuinely feeling it. And most significantly, she noticed that when the question arose of how the tea had been prepared, there was a moment of hesitation in Victoria's testimony, a pause so brief that only someone watching for it would have detected it. The autumn light was beginning to fade beyond the windows of the villa hall, casting long shadows across the floor. Inspector Calloway, having collected his statements, seemed satisfied that this would be a straightforward case of natural causes, or at worst, a tragic accident. He was already making arrangements with Dr. Hartley to perform a preliminary examination before the official coroner's inquest. But Miss Marple, settling back into her chair with her cold tea before her, had only just begun to think. The preliminary examination was conducted that evening in the village surgery, a modern annex to Dr. Hartley's residence that smelled of disinfectant and the particular sterility that came from a place dedicated to the clinical assessment of human suffering. Miss Marple had not been present for this examination, of course. Such things were not the province of village ladies, no matter how observant they might be, but she had long ago learned that information, like water, found its way through the cracks in even the most careful discretion. It was Mrs. Timmins, who cleaned both the surgery and the vicarage, who provided the essential detail. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the following morning with a pot of jam she had made and a mouth full of carefully curated gossip, the two items functioning in tandem as they so often did. "Poison, they're saying," Mrs. Timmins announced, setting the jam on the kitchen counter with the ceremony of someone delivering classified intelligence. "Not natural causes at all. Dr. Hartley found traces of something in her tea, and now they're re-waiting for the toxicology results to come back from the city. But poison, mark my words, someone put poison in poor Margaret's tea." Miss Marple, who had been arranging flowers in a vase with the meticulous care she brought to all her endeavors, did not look up. "How very distressing. And does anyone have any idea what sort of poison?" "That's the curious thing," Mrs. Timmins continued, settling herself uninvited into a chair by the window. "Dr. Hartley wouldn't say much about it, but I heard him on the telephone with the inspector. Something about the symptoms suggesting arsenic, but they won't know for certain until the proper tests are done. Could take days." Arsenic. Miss Marple turned this word over in her mind, considering its implications. Arsenic was not a poison one simply had lying about the house. Unless one was involved in certain professions or hobbies, it was not a crime of passion, accomplished in a moment of rage with whatever came to hand. It was deliberate. It was planned. It was, in its own quiet way, rather methodical. "And the tea itself?" Miss Marple asked. "Where was it prepared?" "In the kitchen of the village hall, from what I understand. Victoria Chen made it, brought it to Margaret herself. Though I shouldn't say made it. She merely poured the hot water over a prepared cup. Anyone could have put the poison in the cup before Victoria filled it, I suppose. Or even after, if one was quick about it. This was an important distinction, Miss Marple reflected. The timing of the poisoning narrowed the field of suspects considerably, or rather, it widened it, depending on how one looked at it. If the poison had been introduced before the water was poured, then Victoria Chen would have had ample opportunity, as would anyone else with access to the kitchen during the festival. But if it had been added afterward, the window of opportunity became much tighter, much more specific. By noon, Inspector Calloway had returned to the village with a full forensic team and a considerably more serious demeanor. The village hall was cordoned off, and a formal investigation was established. The tea things that Margaret Pemberton had used were carefully photographed and labeled. The kitchen was examined with meticulous attentio. N to detail. Staff members and volunteers who had been present during the festival were called back in for more rigorous questioning. And yet, despite all this official activity, Miss Marple found herself thinking about something quite different. She was thinking about Eleanor Hartley's trembling hands, about Victoria Chen's slightly slurred speech when questioned, about Dr. Hartley's apparent composure in the face of a death that should have disturbed him more profoundly. She was thinking about the particular tone of Eleanor's voice when she mentioned that Victoria had brought Margaret the tea, as though this fact required particular emphasis. On the afternoon of the second day, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, her pace measured and unhurried, her attention seemingly focused on the autumn leaves and the behavior of the local birds. But her eyes were actually occupied with observing her neighbors. She watched as Eleanor Hartley emerged from the post office, her face drawn and her shopping abandoned half completed. She observed Dr. Hartley's car arriving at the surgery later than usual, and she noted that he sat for nearly 5 minutes before emerging, his hands gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored to solid ground. Most interesting of all, however, was her encounter with young Thomas Pemberton, Margaret's nephew, who had arrived from the city to manage his aunt's affairs. He was a man of perhaps 40, with the harried expression of someone accustomed to making quick decisions in high-pressure situations. Miss Marple encountered him near the church, and when she offered her condolences, his response was oddly bitter. Aunt Margaret was not an easy woman, he said, his voice carrying an edge that seemed to surprise even himself. But she didn't deserve this. "And I'll tell you something, Miss Marple, I've Al." Reddy told the inspector as much, but she had become increasingly difficult in her financial dealings. She had begun threatening to cut certain people from her will, people in this village. Here he paused, as though considering whether to say more, and then added, "People who had quite depended on her generosity." This was a revelation of considerable importance. Miss Marple had not known that Margaret possessed significant means, though it was perhaps not surprising. The old widow had always worn good jewelry, and her cottage, though modest in appearance, was undoubtedly valuable. But more importantly, the suggestion that Margaret had been using her will as a weapon, threatening to disinherit those who displeased her, opened entirely new possibilities. As Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind was already organizing these new facts, positioning them against everything else she had observed. A pattern was beginning to emerge from the chaos of events and emotions, like a picture gradually resolving from a field of static. The toxicology results arrived on the morning of the 4th day, and they confirmed what Dr. Hartley had already suspected. Margaret Pemberton had been poisoned with arsenic, administered in a carefully measured dose that would have taken effect gradually, causing the weakness and confusion that Victoria Chen had observed. The poison had been in her tea, and the preliminary analysis suggested it had been introduced into the cup before the hot water was poured, allowing it to dissolve completely and become virtually undetectable to taste or sight. Inspector Calloway called an informal gathering at the village hall that afternoon, ostensibly to update the community on the investigation's progress, but really, Miss Marple suspected, to observe his suspects in a more relaxed setting and see if anyone betrayed themselves through careless words or nervous behavior. The hall had been restored to its normal state, the festival decorations taken down, the flower arrangements wilted and discarded. It seemed somehow appropriate that the cheerful autumn display had been replaced with nothing but empty tables and echoing space. "We are pursuing several lines of inquiry," Calloway explained, standing before the assembled villagers with the gravity of a man who had suddenly discovered that a murder investigation was considerably more complicated than a routine accident. The arsenic must have come from somewhere. It is not a substance commonly found in household inventories, and we are investigating all possible sources. As he spoke, Miss Marple watched Eleanor Hartley's face. The woman was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her hands, those perpetually trembling hands, were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Beside her, Dr. Hartley maintained his professional composure, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible deepening of the lines around his mouth. These were the signs of a man under considerable strain, though whether that strain came from guilt or merely from the stress of having one's wife involved in such a dreadful business was yet to be determined. Victoria Chen sat near the back, her nurse's uniform still crisp despite the events of the past few days, her face a study in controlled neutrality. Yet Miss Marple had observed something interesting in the pharmacy records that Inspector Calloway had obtained. Victoria had access to various chemical compounds in her professional capacity, and while arsenic was not commonly used in modern medical practice, the records did show that the surgery maintained certain historical preparations, including some that contained arsenic in carefully measured forms. After the gathering concluded, Miss Marple made a deliberate point of approaching Dr. Hartley, who was preparing to leave with Eleanor. She touched his arm gently, her manner that of a concerned friend, rather than someone fishing for information. "Dr. Hartley, might I have a brief word? A private matter of a medical nature." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she could hardly object without appearing discourteous. Dr. Hartley, ever the professional, agreed, and they moved to a quiet corner of the emptied hall, while Eleanor waited with visible impatience by the door. "I do hope this won't take long," Dr. Hartley said, his tone polite but guarded. "Eleanor and I were just about to have dinner." "It is a delicate matter," Miss Marple began, her voice pitched low and gentle. "I have been troubled by something, and I thought perhaps you, with your medical knowledge, might be able to ease my mind. When Victoria Chen brought Margaret her tea, did you notice anything unusual about her manner? Any indication that she might be distressed or anxious about something?" Dr. Hartle. Eyes narrowed slightly. "Why do you ask?" "Merely because I have observed that young women often show signs of stress that others miss, the way they hold their shoulders, the particular quality of their voice. I wondered if you, being observant in such matters, had noticed anything that might be relevant to the investigation." For a moment, Dr. Hartley said nothing. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully measured. "Victoria has been a dedicated and reliable employee for 3 years. She would have no motive to harm Margaret Pemberton." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed, though she noted that he had not actually answered her question. "I was merely thinking that if she had seemed anxious or afraid, it might suggest that someone had pressured her to do something against her better judgment. Sometimes young people are very susceptible to manipulation by those in authority over them." There was a pause during which Miss Marple could almost hear the mechanical turning of Dr. Hartley's mind as he calculated how much to reveal and how much to conceal. When he finally responded, his voice carried a note of something that might have been warning or might have been desperation. "Miss Marple, I would advise you to be very careful about making unfounded suggestions. Accusations of that sort could be dangerous. To all parties involved, it was not quite a threat, but it was close enough that even the most diplomatic of women might have felt the chill in it." Miss Marple withdrew gracefully, thanking him for his time and returning to her seat as though the conversation had been nothing more significant than a brief discussion about the weather. As she watched Dr. and Mrs. Hartley depart, she found herself thinking about the particular ways that marriages could become prisons and the lengths to which desperate people would sometimes go to escape them. She was also thinking about Victoria Chen's nervous fingers, and about the curious fact that Victoria had been present at the moment of discovery, had, in fact, been the person to find Margaret's body. The pieces were beginning to fit together now, though not in the way that Inspector Calloway was probably imagining. The puzzle was more complex than a simple case of a nurse administering poison to a difficult patient. It was a puzzle that involved loyalty and fear, love and desperation, and the peculiar power dynamics that existed within a marriage that had perhaps begun with passion, but had calcified into something far more troubling. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage with a pot of Earl Grey in her knitting, allowing her hands to move through the familiar motions while her mind worked through the problem before her, with the systematic precision of a master clockmaker disassembling an intricate mechanism. The television murmured in the background, something she watched mostly out of habit, but her attention was entirely focused on the patterns of behavior she had observed. She thought first of Eleanor Hartley, whose trembling hands and strained demeanor suggested a woman under considerable psychological pressure. Eleanor had been married to Dr. Hartley for 30 years? Perhaps longer. In that time, Miss Marple had observed the slow erosion of Eleanor's confidence, The way her opinions had gradually become tentative, the manner in which she seemed always to be seeking her husband's approval before expressing even the most innocuous thought. This was not the behavior of a woman in a happy marriage. This was the behavior of a woman who had learned to doubt her own judgment. And yet Eleanor had also been the one to inherit, or would inherit, once the estate was settled, a considerable sum from Margaret Pemberton's will. Or so the village gossip suggested. This was a detail worth pursuing, Miss Marple thought, though the conventional wisdom would probably assume that Eleanor had poisoned Margaret out of pure greed. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that greed, while a powerful motivator, was rarely the whole story. People were far more complicated than that. Then there was Victoria Chen, whose access to arsenic and whose presence at the scene of discovery made her an obvious suspect in the eyes of Inspector Calloway and his team. But obvious suspects, Miss Marple had found through decades of observation, were often red herrings, convenient targets upon which the lazy mind could settle its attention. Victoria was young, ambitious, and clearly intelligent. Would such a woman really poison a patient in such a crude and detectable manner? It seemed unlikely, unless she had been compelled to do so by someone she feared or felt obligated to obey. Which brought Miss Marple back to Dr. Hartley himself, a man whose authority within the village was nearly absolute, whose medical knowledge was extensive, and whose access to poisons was virtually unrestricted. A man, moreover, who had seemed remarkably composed in the face of Margaret Pemberton's death, too composed, perhaps, for someone who had known the victim all his professional life. But what would Dr. Hartley's motive have been? This was where the puzzle became more intricate. Margaret had been a difficult woman, yes, but people did not typically murder their most annoying acquaintances, no matter how tiresome they became. There had to be something more personal, something more threatening to Dr. Hartley's position or security. The telephone rang at 9:30, startling Miss Marple from her reverie. It was Constable Webb, a young policeman whom she had known since his childhood, calling to inform her that Inspector Calloway would like to conduct a more formal interview with several of the key witnesses the following morning. Would Miss Marple be available to provide her observations from the day of the festival? She agreed readily, though she knew precisely what Calloway wanted. He wanted her account of the events to corroborate or contradict the statements already given. What he did not realize was that Miss Marple's observations extended far beyond the simple facts of who had been where at what time. She had seen the glances exchanged, the tensions carefully concealed beneath polite conversation, the small gestures that revealed the true nature of relationships within the village. After the constable rang off, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and rose to retrieve a small leather journal from her writing desk. Over the years, she had maintained a habit of recording interesting details about the people around her. Nothing malicious, merely observations about human nature and the patterns of behavior that seemed to repeat themselves across different circumstances and different individuals. She flipped through the pages, looking for her earlier notes about the Hartley household. There. Several months ago, she had recorded an observation. Eleanor had mentioned in passing that Dr. Hartley had become increasingly irritable about Margaret Pemberton's visits to the surgery. Margaret had been a chronic complainer, always presenting with various ailments that seemed to have more psychological than physical origin. The doctor had apparently made some cutting remarks about hypochondriacs and time-wasters. But then, more recently, Miss Marple had noted something else. Victoria Chen had begun to appear uncomfortable in Margaret Pemberton's presence. The young nurse had started to make excuses to leave the room when Margaret arrived for her appointments, and Eleanor had commented, in that peculiar way of hers, that Victoria seemed to have taken against the old woman. Why would Victoria take against Margaret Pemberton? What could possibly have occurred between them to create such obvious tension? Miss Marple closed her eyes, allowing her mind to explore the possibilities. Victoria was a young, unmarried woman with her whole life ahead of her. Margaret was an elderly widow with a tendency to be judgmental and disapproving. What could have passed between them that would warrant such a reaction? Unless, Miss Marple thought slowly, Victoria had been a patient as well as a nurse. Unless Margaret had observed or discovered something about Victoria that had given her leverage, or that had caused her to become disapproving in that particular cutting way she had. The pieces were still not fitting quite right, but Miss Marple could sense that she was drawing close to something important. Tomorrow's interview with Inspector Calloway would provide her with an opportunity to observe the suspects under more formal conditions, to watch for the tells that would reveal which of them possessed the most to lose and the most to fear. She returned to her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet room, and waited for morning to arrive. The interview room at the village police station was a deliberately neutral space, painted in shades of institutional grey, and furnished with the kind of uncomfortable chairs that seemed designed to discourage lingering. Inspector Calloway had positioned himself behind a metal desk, with Constable Webb standing near the door, his notebook at the ready. Miss Marple had been offered the most comfortable chair available, a small courtesy that spoke to Calloway's awareness of her age and status within the community. "I appreciate your time, Miss Marple," Calloway began, his tone suggesting that he regarded her presence as a formality rather than a matter of genuine investigative importance. "I understand why. You have excellent observational skills. Perhaps you noticed something during the festival that might help us determine exactly when the poison was introduced into Mrs. Pemberton's tea." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap with serene composure. "I observed a great many things, Inspector, though I confess some of them may not seem immediately relevant to your investigation. Would it be helpful if I began with what I actually witnessed, rather than attempting to guess what might be significant?" Calloway nodded, settling back in his chair with the expression of a man preparing to listen to an elderly woman discuss the irrelevant details of village life. He could not have been more wrong in his assessment, though Miss Marple made no effort to disabuse him of this misconception. "I arrived at the festival at approximately 2 o'clock, she began, her voice measured and precise. The hall was already quite crowded. "I spent the first 30 minutes examining the flower arrangements and the harvest displays. During this time, I observed that Eleanor Hartley appeared anxious. Her attention seemed divided between her duties as organizer and something, or someone, else entirely. Who, specifically, was she paying attention to?" Calloway asked, his pen poised over his notebook. "Victoria Chen." The nurse seemed to be assisting with various tasks in the kitchen. Eleanor kept glancing toward the kitchen doorway, as though she were monitoring Victoria's movements. This struck me as curious, because one does not typically supervise one's husband's employee so closely during a public function. Calloway made a note, though Miss Marple could see from his expression that he was not yet grasping the significance of this observation. She continued, undeterred. "At approximately 3 o'clock, Mrs. Pemberton arrived. She was in a particularly difficult mood, more so than usual, I would say. She made critical remarks about nearly every aspect of the festival's organization. She commented specifically that Eleanor's taste in flowers was ostentatious and lacking in restraint. Eleanor's reaction to this criticism was interesting. Rather than becoming defensive, she seemed almost relieved, as though she had been expecting precisely such a comment. "What would lead you to that conclusion?" Calloway asked, his skepticism evident. "The body language," Miss Marple explained gently. "When someone receives criticism unexpectedly, they typically show signs of surprise, a slight tightening of the shoulders, a change in facial expression. Eleanor showed neither of these signs. She had prepared herself for Margaret's disapproval. She was, one might say, waiting for it." Miss Marple paused to allow Calloway time to process this information before continuing. "Shortly thereafter, I observed Victoria Chen emerge from the kitchen carrying a cup of tea. She brought it to Margaret Pemberton. This is where the timing becomes important. I was standing quite close to them, and I noticed that Victoria hesitated before handing the cup to Margaret. It was only a momentary hesitation, but it was distinct. She looked at the cup, then at Margaret, then at the cup again, as though she were battling with herself about whether to proceed. "You believe Victoria poisoned the tea?" Calloway asked, leaning forward with renewed interest. "I believe Victoria handed the poisoned tea to Margaret Pemberton," Miss Marple corrected carefully. "Whether she was the one who introduced the poison is an entirely different matter. One does not typically hesitate before handing someone a beverage, unless one knows something disturbing about that beverage. One hesitates because one is afraid of the consequences of one's actions." Calloway's pen moved more rapidly across the page now, but Miss Marple could see that he was still approaching the problem from the wrong angle. He was still imagining Victoria as the primary actor in this drama, when in fact she was merely a player in a larger production orchestrated by others. "Tell me about Dr. Hartley's movements during the festival," Miss Marple said, shifting her approach. "Did you observe him at all?" "He was present, yes," Calloway replied. "He seemed to be making the rounds, greeting people, performing his role as a prominent member of the community. Nothing unusual that I could detect. Did you observe him in the kitchen at any point?" Calloway consulted his notes. "Not specifically, though he may have been present. The kitchen was a busy area." "It was indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and as a doctor with the authority that comes with such a position, he would have had every reason to be present there without anyone questioning his presence. A doctor checking on the refreshments would scarcely warrant a second glance." Understanding began to dawn in Calloway's eyes, though it was the understanding of someone who had grasped only the surface of the matter. "You believe Dr. Hartley poisoned the tea before Victoria brought it to Margaret?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we must ask ourselves why someone would poison Margaret Pemberton. What did she have, or know, that was worth killing for, and who would have the most to lose from her continued existence?" She leaned forward slightly, her ancient eyes sharp and penetrating. "Dr. Hartley is a man of considerable reputation in this village. That reputation is his most valuable asset. Should something occur that threatened his standing, his career, his marriage, well, one might imagine he would become quite desperate indeed." Calloway was writing furiously now, but Miss Marple could see that he was still not asking himself the right questions. He was focused on Dr. Hartley as the poisoner, when the true puzzle lay in understanding what had driven him to such an act, and more importantly, what role his wife and his employee had played in the matter. "I believe," Miss Marple continued, "that the next step in your investigation should be to examine Dr. Hartley's financial records and his relationship with Margaret Pemberton more closely. And perhaps you might ask Victoria Chen directly whether Dr. Hartley had ever asked her to do something for him that made her feel deeply uncomfortable." Inspector Calloway's investigation took on new urgency following Miss Marple's interview, though the inspector himself seemed uncertain about the precise direction in which to point his suspicions. By that evening, the financial records of Dr. Hartley had been requested from his accountant, and a second, more rigorous interview with Victoria Chen had been scheduled for the following morning. Miss Marple learned these developments through the efficient network of village gossip, which transmitted information with far greater speed and accuracy than the official police channels. She was not surprised, therefore, when Constable Webb appeared at her cottage door at 8:30 that evening, his young face bearing the expression of someone who had been assigned an uncomfortable task. He was carrying a folder, which he presented to Miss Marple with the deference of a man addressing a woman whose observations he had come to respect. "Inspector Calloway thought you might wish to see these," he explained, opening the folder to reveal several pages of financial documentation. "Your comments about examining Dr. Hartley's records were quite helpful. These have just come from his accountant." Miss Marple invited the constable to sit, and together they examined the documents. What they revealed was a portrait of a man in considerable financial distress. Dr. Hartley's practice, it seemed, was not as lucrative as his position in the village might suggest. There were significant debts, loans taken out for the expansion of his surgery, investments that had failed, and most significantly, a series of payments made to someone identified only as MP over the past 18 months. "MP," Miss Marple murmured, her finger tracing the line of entries. "Margaret Pemberton, presumably. Can you tell me the amounts, Constable?" Webb leaned closer, reading from the document. "They start at £500 per month and gradually increase. By the most recent entry, 6 months ago, they had reached £2,000 per month. There are no payments recorded after that point." "And what would cause a man to make such substantial payments to a woman?" Miss Marple asked, though she was not truly expecting an answer. She was thinking aloud, working through the logic of the situation. Blackmail is the obvious answer, but blackmail for what? What could Margaret Pemberton have known about Dr. Hartley that was worth such a considerable sum? Inspector Calloway is pursuing that very question, Webb said carefully. He is, at this moment, conducting interviews with various people who might have knowledge of Dr. Hartley's affairs. Personal affairs, that is. The implication was clear enough. Miss Marple's mind moved quickly through the possibilities. Dr. Hartley was a man of proper appearance and respectable bearing. What secret could he be harboring that was damaging enough to warrant 18 months of increasingly substantial payments? She thought of Victoria Chen, young and intelligent, entirely dependent upon Dr. Hartley for her employment. She thought of Eleanor, gradually losing her confidence and her will within her marriage. "I see," Miss Marple said quietly. "Tell me, Constable, did Dr. Hartley ever employ anyone in his practice prior to Victoria Chen?" Webb consulted another page in the folder. "Yes, actually. There was a previous nurse, a woman named Susan Garrett. She left her position about 2 years ago. The reason given was that she had decided to relocate to London to pursue other opportunities." 2 years ago, Miss Marple repeated. "And the payments to Margaret Pemberton began 18 months ago. That would be 6 months after Miss Garrett's departure. I wonder if Miss Garrett might have discussed certain matters with Margaret Pemberton before she left the village." Understanding began to crystallize in the constable's young face. "You think Margaret was blackmailing Dr. Hartley about something that happened with his previous employee?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that Margaret Pemberton was a woman who paid attention to gossip and who was not above using that knowledge for her own benefit. And I think Dr. Hartley may have found himself in an increasingly impossible situation. The payments were growing, and there would have been no end in sight. A man in such circumstances might begin to think of solutions that are permanent rather than merely temporary." Webb departed shortly thereafter. The folder of documents returned to him for further investigation. Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, the fire burning low in the hearth, and allowed her mind to trace the outlines of the tragedy that had unfolded in her seemingly peaceful village. The following morning brought news that Victoria Chen had finally broken under questioning. She had, it transpired, been pressured by Dr. Hartley to add the arsenic to Margaret Pemberton's tea. He had threatened her with dismissal, and with something worse, though Victoria had been reluctant to specify exactly what that something worse entailed. She had resisted his pressure for weeks, but on the morning of the festival, he had been more forceful, more insistent. He had told her that if she did not comply, he would ensure that her professional reputation would be destroyed, that he would claim she had been stealing from the surgery, that he would make her life impossible. Inspector Calloway arrived at Miss Marple's cottage in person to inform her of these developments. He was, she could see, slightly uncomfortable about the matter, aware that while he had followed her suggestions, it was Miss Marple who had truly solved the puzzle. "We have Dr. Hartley in custody," Calloway explained. "He is not making any confession, but the evidence is quite strong. Victoria Chen's testimony, combined with the financial records and the poisoning itself, I believe we have sufficient grounds for charges." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "And Eleanor? What does she say about all of this?" Calloway shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Mrs. Hartley appears to have been unaware of her husband's actions, though she did admit, during questioning, that she had suspected something was troubling him. She had not guessed what, but Miss Marple suspected that Eleanor had known more than she had admitted. The trembling hands, the careful avoidance of Victoria's gaze, these were the signs of a woman who had sensed the wrongness in her marriage, but had been too afraid to confront it directly. Shh! Arrest of Dr. Marcus Hartley sent a shockwave through St. Crispin's village that seemed to reverberate through every cottage and shop, every drawing room and garden fence. Within hours, the careful facade of respectability that had concealed the village's true nature began to crack and crumble, revealing the complexity and dysfunction that had always lurked beneath the surface of polite society. Miss Marple observed these developments with the patient attention of an entomologist, studying the behavior of insects exposed to sudden light. The village, she reflected, was like a stone overturned in a garden. Suddenly, all manner of hidden creatures were visible, scurrying and confused by their unexpected exposure to scrutiny. It was Eleanor Hartley who came to her door 3 days after her husband's arrest, her composure finally shattered into something more honest than the controlled anxiety she had previously maintained. She appeared smaller somehow, diminished, as though the removal of her husband had taken something essential from her physical form. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands, those hands that had trembled so noticeably during the festival, were now steady, though it seemed a steadiness born of numbness rather than confidence. "I wanted to speak with you before the trial," Eleanor said, settling into the chair that Miss Marple offered her. "I wanted you to understand what it was like, living with him, knowing that something was profoundly wrong, but not knowing what." Miss Marple poured tea with her customary deliberation, allowing Eleanor time to gather her thoughts. The younger woman accepted the cup gratefully and held it as though it were the only anchor keeping her from drifting away entirely. "When did you begin to suspect?" Miss Marple asked gently. "About 6 months ago," Eleanor replied. "There were phone calls late at night. He would take M in his study with the door closed. His mood became erratic. Sometimes he seemed almost jovial, other times he was irritable and withdrawn. And then there was his behavior with Victoria. He became very particular about her schedule, insisting that I not make social plans on the evenings when she was working. He said he needed her available for emergencies, but I knew it was more than that." "What did you think was occurring?" Miss Marple asked. Eleanor's face flushed, and she looked away. "I thought perhaps he was having an affair with her. I hated thinking it, but I couldn't explain his behavior any other way. Young women, attractive women. I thought perhaps age had made him foolish. But it was not an affair," Miss Marple said, though it was not quite a question. "No," Eleanor confirmed. When the police questioned me, they explained what had actually been happening, that Margaret had been blackmailing him, that she had discovered something about his conduct with a previous employee, a young woman named Susan who left rather abruptly 2 years ago. I asked Victoria about it after everything came out. She finally told me what Dr. Hartley had done to Susan Garrett." Miss Marple waited, knowing that Eleanor needed to speak these painful truths aloud, and that her presence as a listener was itself a form of service. "He had made inappropriate advances toward her," Eleanor said quietly. When she refused him, he suggested that her position might become untenable if she did not reconsider. She was frightened, and she left the village to escape him. Margaret somehow learned of this. Perhaps Susan confided in someone before she departed, and Margaret used the knowledge to extract money from him, and he could not escape the arrangement, Miss Marple observed. "No, he could not." The payments grew larger, and Margaret seemed to take pleasure in his desperation. According to T. Police, she told him that she intended to increase the amount still further, that she planned to make him pay for the rest of his life. Marcus became convinced that there was no way out except for what he did. Eleanor set down her teacup and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook silently, whether from weeping or from some deeper upheaval of emotion. Miss Marple could not quite determine. "I should have seen it," Eleanor continued after a moment. "I should have asked more questions, demanded answers, but I was so afraid of what I might discover, afraid of what it would mean for my life, for my marriage. So I told myself that I was simply being foolish and suspicious. I allowed myself to remain ignorant." Miss Marple reached across and patted Eleanor's hand with the same gentle touch she might have used to comfort a frightened child. "You could not have prevented what occurred," she said. "Your husband made choices that led him down a path from which he could not return. Those choices were his own. But what will happen to Victoria now?" Eleanor asked. "She was coerced into participating in his crime. She is innocent. I suspect the courts will recognize her victimization," Miss Marple said. "She is young, and her future need not be entirely determined by this unfortunate incident. What happens next will depend, to some extent, on her own resilience and determination." After Eleanor departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage and reflected on the curious ways that human weakness could cascade through a community, touching and damaging multiple lives in its path. Dr. Hartley's initial transgression with Susan Garrett had created the circumstances for Margaret's blackmail, which had led to desperation, which had resulted in murder. It was a chain of cause and effect that demonstrated, once again, the truth that Miss Marple had learned over her many years of observation, that no sin, however small or concealed, could remain hidden forever. The universe, it seemed, had a way of ensuring that hidden things eventually came to light, though often at considerable cost. The sun was setting outside her window, painting the cottage in shades of amber and purple. The autumn had turned to early winter, and the village would soon be preparing for the Christmas season, those celebrations of hope and renewal that seemed somehow hollow in light of recent events. Yet Miss Marple knew that such was the nature of life in small communities. Tragedy struck, and then gradually, almost imperceptibly, normal routines reasserted themselves. The village would heal, not because it would forget, but because memory, in human experience, was a faculty that gradually softened and blurred the sharp edges of pain. The trial of Dr. Marcus Hartley took place in the county courthouse 6 weeks after his arrest, and it attracted considerable attention from the press, who seemed fascinated by the story of a respected physician brought low by blackmail and desperation. The headlines were predictably sensational: Doctor's Dark Secret, Village Murder Plot Unravels, and most irritatingly, Miss Marple Cracks Case, which ascribed to Miss Marple a dramatic role that she had never intended to play. Miss Marple attended the trial, as she felt it was her duty to do so, though she found the proceedings somewhat tedious in their formality. The evidence was presented methodically: the financial records, Victoria Chen's testimony given in a voice barely above a whisper, the toxicological analysis confirming arsenic in Margaret Pemberton's system. Dr. Hartley's defense was weak, built primarily on the argument that while he had blackmailed, he had not himself introduced the poison into the tea, that Victoria Chen had done so of her own volition. But this argument collapsed almost immediately when Victoria's testimony made clear the coercive circumstances under which she had acted. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Miss Patricia Ashworth, methodically walked through the sequence of events that had led to Margaret's death. She presented the evidence of Dr. Hartley's earlier misconduct with Susan Garrett, drawing from court documents that Susan herself had been willing to provide, though she had not wished to appear in person. The picture that emerged was of a man who had established a pattern of predatory behavior, who had used his position and authority to exploit those vulnerable to his influence. What the trial did not fully explore, what indeed could not be fully explored in a public courtroom, was the question of intention. Had Dr. Hartley deliberately planned Margaret's murder, or had the decision come to him gradually, as his desperation mounted and his options dwindled? The law, Miss Marple understood, cared little for such distinctions. Intent was either present or absent. Desperation was merely a circumstance, not an excuse. On the final day of the trial, Miss Marple found herself sitting near Victoria Chen in the courthouse hallway during a recess. The young nurse looked hollowed out, diminished by the ordeal of public testimony and the weight of the secret she had been forced to carry. She had not yet been charged with any crime, though the legal proceedings against her remained pending, contingent upon the recommendation of the prosecutor. "Miss Marple," Victoria said quietly, apparently gathering courage for the conversation, "I wanted to thank you. Without your intervention, I fear I might have been convicted along with Dr. Hartley. I might have spent years in prison for something I was forced to do against my will." Miss Marple regarded the young woman with careful attention. "You should not thank me for observing what was plainly evident to anyone paying attention. The hesitation you showed when handing Margaret the cup, that was sufficient to indicate that you were acting under duress rather than from your own volition. The law recognizes such circumstances. Still," Victoria continued, "you could have remained silent. You could have allowed Inspector Calloway to follow his obvious suspicions." "I could have," Miss Marple agreed. "But justice requires more than merely identifying a guilty party. It requires identifying the true circumstances that led to guilt. You were a victim, not a perpetrator. Those circumstances forced you to participate in a terrible act." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, though she managed to contain them through visible effort. "I don't know what I will do now. My reputation in nursing is damaged. No hospital will employ me after this scandal becomes known. I have been considering leaving St. Crispin's entirely, perhaps moving to another county where people do not know my name." "That may indeed be wise," Miss Marple said gently. "A fresh beginning is sometimes the most merciful gift one can give oneself. though I would suggest that you do not flee from shame, but rather move towards something, toward a new life deliberately chosen rather than one merely stumbled into through circumstance. When the trial concluded, the verdict was guilty of murder. Dr. Hartley received a sentence of life imprisonment, which meant that he would spend his remaining years in confinement, stripped of the authority and respectability that had been the foundation of his identity. Miss Marple observed his reaction as the sentence was pronounced, a kind of numbness that suggested he had anticipated this outcome but had hoped nonetheless for clemency. Eleanor attended the sentencing, sitting alone in the gallery, her face carefully composed. After the verdict was delivered, she rose and left the courthouse without looking toward her husband. The newspapers would later report that Eleanor had already begun proceedings for divorce, and that she intended to return to her maiden name and reclaim whatever independence might be possible for a woman of her age and circumstances. The village of St. Crispin's gradually returned to its normal routines as autumn turned toward winter. The scandal faded from the national newspapers, replaced by more recent sensations. New doctors arrived to take over Dr. Hartley's practice, and the surgery was methodically scrubbed clean of any association with the previous physician. Susan Garrett, the young woman whose vulnerability had inadvertently set the entire chain of events in motion, wrote to Miss Marple expressing her gratitude that her attacker had finally faced consequences for his actions. But it was Miss Marple herself who seemed most affected by the resolution of the case, though in a manner entirely consistent with her nature. She simply sat in her cottage, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked, and reflected on the complex interplay of human weakness, circumstance and choice that had resulted in Margaret Pemberton's death. Winter arrived in St. Crispin's, with a kind of quiet persistence that characterized the season in the English countryside, not dramatic or violent, but steady and thorough in its transformation of the landscape. The village, which had been thrown into turmoil by the murder and its subsequent investigation, began the slow process of settling into a new equilibrium. The scandal had faded from public consciousness, replaced by the more immediate concerns of Christmas preparations and the turning of the year. It was during this period of apparent normalcy that Miss Marple found herself reflecting on something that had troubled her since the trial's conclusion. The evidence against Dr. Hartley had been compelling, certainly, but there remained one detail that continued to nag at her consciousness, a small inconsistency that she had observed but had not mentioned to Inspector Calloway. The tea kettle. On the morning of the festival, Miss Marple had noted with her characteristic attention to domestic detail that the kettle in the village hall's kitchen had been filled quite recently. She had observed this because she had been standing near it when Victoria Chen had been preparing Margaret's tea. The water had still been at a rolling boil, the steam rising vigorously from the spout. Yet when the toxicology report was filed, it noted that the arsenic would have required time to dissolve completely in the heated water, perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a minute, depending on the fineness of the powder and the exact temperature of the water. This raised a question that Miss Marple had not yet fully resolved. Had Dr. Hartley introduced the arsenic into the cup before the hot water was poured, or had someone else done so? The evidence had proceeded on the assumption that it had been done before, but what if that assumption had been incorrect? On a grey December afternoon, with snow beginning to fall in the kind of lazy, half-hearted manner that suggested it might not accumulate, Miss Marple found herself walking past the Hartley residence. The house stood empty now, waiting for new tenants, or perhaps for Eleanor to decide its fate. Miss Marple paused at the gate, studying the structure with the attention of someone reading a particularly complex passage in a book. She was so absorbed in her observation that she did not notice Eleanor approaching until the woman was quite close. Eleanor had changed considerably in the week since her husband's conviction. There was a straightness to her posture that had not been present before, and her eyes, while still sad, carried a quality of determination rather than the timid anxiety that had characterized them previously. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice steady, "I wondered if I might find you here. I have been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you privately." They adjourned to Eleanor's temporary residence, a small cottage that she had rented in the village while she settled her affairs. The interior was sparse but meticulously organized, and Eleanor moved through the space with the confidence of someone who had finally begun to reclaim her own life. She offered tea, which Miss Marple accepted, and they settled into chairs positioned before a modest fire. "I have been meaning to speak with you for some time," Eleanor began, her words carefully chosen. "There is something about the events surrounding Margaret's death that I have not disclosed to the police, and I believe you should know of it." Miss Marple set down her teacup and gave Eleanor her complete attention. "Please proceed," she said simply. "The truth is," Eleanor continued, "that I knew my husband was being blackmailed. I had known for some months. I did not know the specific details, but I understood that Margaret Pemberton was extorting money from him and that he was becoming increasingly desperate as a result." "Did you know the nature of the blackmail?" Miss Marple asked. Eleanor's face colored slightly. "Not at first, but I made inquiries, discreet inquiries, you understand. I spoke with someone who had been acquainted with Susan Garrett before she left the village. What I learned disturbed me greatly. My husband's conduct toward that young woman was inexcusable, and I realized that the blackmail, while wrong, was not entirely without justification." "What did you do with this knowledge?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but penetrating. "I confronted him," Eleanor said. "Not in a dramatic fashion, but I made clear that I knew what was occurring, and that his behavior was unacceptable. I told him that I would not remain in a marriage with a man who preyed upon vulnerable young women. I said that either he must confess what he had done and seek some form of redemption, or I would leave him." Eleanor paused, gathering herself before continuing. "He became very angry. He said that my threatening to leave was precisely the kind of pressure that had driven him to desperation in the first place, that women's demands and judgments had pushed him to the point of considering extreme measures." Miss Marple found herself leaning forward slightly. "When did this conversation take place?" 3 days before the festival," Eleanor replied. "I told him that I would give him until Christmas to decide what he would do, whether he would confess or whether I would leave. I said that I could no longer live with uncertainty and with the knowledge of his conduct, and how did he respond to this ultimatum?" Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she picked up her teacup. "He said that perhaps Margaret Pemberton would solve the problem for him by increasing her demands until he had no choice but to take drastic action. He said it in a way that suggested he was merely speaking hypothetically, but I understood that he meant it as a threat toward Margaret, or toward himself, or perhaps toward both of us. I became very frightened." Miss Marple absorbed this revelation, understanding now what Eleanor had perhaps not fully articulated to herself, that Eleanor had inadvertently created the final impetus for Dr. Hartley's decision to poison Margaret Pemberton. By threatening to leave him, by withdrawing her tacit acceptance of his circumstances, Eleanor had removed the last barrier between Dr. Hartley and an act of desperate violence. "Did you tell the police of this conversation?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Eleanor admitted. "I was afraid that they would blame me, would suggest that my ultimatum had caused his actions. And perhaps they would have been correct. Perhaps if I had simply remained silent, if I had continued to pretend that I did not know what was occurring, Margaret would still be alive." Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and moved to the window, where she could see the snow beginning to accumulate on the village streets. "You must not blame yourself," she said quietly. "Your husband made his own choices. You merely spoke truthfully about the consequences those choices would have for your marriage. That is not something for which you should bear guilt." Yet even as she spoke these words, Miss Marple understood that Eleanor would carry this burden for the rest of her life, and that no reassurance, however logical, could fully relieve her of it. The conversation with Eleanor left Miss Marple with much to contemplate, and in the days that followed, she found herself returning again and again to the sequence of events that had culminated in Margaret Pemberton's death. She sat in her cottage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, but her mind was engaged in the more intricate work of unraveling the true nature of what had occurred in St. Crispin's village. The more she considered Eleanor's revelation, the more Miss Marple understood that the case, while ostensibly solved, had a deeper complexity that had not been fully explored in the courtroom. Dr. Hartley had been convicted of murder based on the evidence of his financial desperation and his coercion of Victoria Chen. But the true catalyst for his act had been Eleanor's ultimatum, her demand that he face the consequences of his actions or lose his marriage. This raised a question that troubled Miss Marple's conscience. Had justice truly been served, or had merely the most obvious guilty party been convicted, while the more subtle and complex causes of the tragedy had been overlooked? On Christmas Eve, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was Inspector Calloway himself, who appeared at her door carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. He seemed uncomfortable, a man who had come to communicate something that did not fit neatly into the categories with which he normally worked. "I have been reviewing the case files," Calloway explained, settling himself into the chair that Miss Marple offered him. "There is a matter that has been troubling me, and I felt it only proper to bring it to your attention, given your observations throughout the investigation." Miss Marple waited, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "The forensic evidence regarding the arsenic," Calloway continued, "has been re-examined by a specialist from the city. It appears that while the poison was certainly present in the cup from which Margaret drank, the precise manner in which it was introduced may not have been as straightforward as we concluded during the trial." "In what way?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The specialist has suggested that the arsenic may have been introduced into the cup after the hot water was poured, rather than before. The method of dissolution would be slightly different in each case, and the residue patterns suggest the latter scenario is more likely. This creates a problem for our conviction, because it means that Dr. Hartley could not have been the one to introduce the poison, given that he was observed in conversation with the vicar at the precise moment when Victoria was pouring the water." Miss Marple felt a curious sensation, as though a piece of architecture she had believed to be solid was revealing itself to be constructed of something far more fragile. "Who else had access to the cup during that critical moment?" she asked. "That is what troubles me," Calloway admitted. "The kitchen was crowded. Any number of people could have approached the cup without drawing particular attention. We have been assuming that Victoria's hesitation indicated coercion by Dr. Hartley, but what if her hesitation indicated something else entirely?" Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and moved to the window, where the Christmas lights that the village had strung along the main street twinkled against the darkening sky. She thought of Eleanor, who had been present at the festival. She thought of Eleanor's trembling hands, her anxiety, her carefully controlled demeanor. She thought of the conversation Eleanor had reported having with her husband 3 days before the festival, in which Eleanor had issued an ultimatum. "Tell me," Miss Marple said, turning back to Calloway, "has anyone made inquiries regarding Eleanor Hartley's movements during the festival? Specifically, her movements in and around the kitchen during the time when Margaret's tea was being prepared?" Calloway's expression shifted, understanding dawning across his features. I believe," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that you should review the witness statements with particular attention to Eleanor's presence in the kitchen. I suspect you will find that she was there at the precise moment when Victoria was pouring the water. What followed was a reopening of the investigation that Inspector Calloway carried out with considerably more care and attention than the original inquiry. Witnesses were re-interviewed, and their statements were examined with fresh scrutiny. What emerged was a picture strikingly different from the one that had sent Dr. Hartley to prison. Eleanor Hartley had indeed been in the kitchen at the critical moment. More significantly, she had been observed by one of the kitchen volunteers, a woman who had not been asked any direct questions about Eleanor's movements, standing quite close to the cup from which Margaret would shortly drink. Eleanor had also been noted leaving the kitchen in considerable haste immediately afterward, despite having no apparent reason to do so. When confronted with this evidence, Eleanor finally revealed the truth. She had poisoned Margaret Pemberton, not out of malice or greed, but out of a desperate conviction that removing the blackmailer would save her marriage. She had obtained the arsenic from her late father's gardening supplies, which she had kept for sentimental reasons. She had added it to Margaret's tea at the moment when Victoria's attention was focused on the kettle, and she had relied on Victoria's hesitation and distress to deflect suspicion toward coercion by her husband. What Eleanor had not anticipated was that her husband, discovering what she had done, would choose to accept blame rather than expose his wife's guilt. In a moment of unexpected nobility, Dr. Hartley had allowed himself to be convicted rather than reveal that his wife had committed the murder ostensibly to save their marriage. He had understood, perhaps for the first time, the depth of Eleanor's desperation and had chosen to spare her the consequences of her act. Miss Marple learned of Eleanor's arrest through the same efficient network of village gossip that had served her throughout the investigation. She felt no satisfaction at this development, only a profound sadness at the complexity of human motivation and the tragic consequences that flowed from good intentions pursued through terrible means. On the evening of Eleanor's arrest, as Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage with her knitting, she reflected on the nature of justice and truth. The law would now seek Eleanor's conviction, and the case would be reopened, analyzed, and discussed once more. But Miss Marple understood that true justice was far more elusive than the verdict of any courtroom. She understood that Eleanor, in her desperation to save her marriage, had destroyed it far more completely than any amount of blackmail ever could have done. The Christmas season came and went, and St. Crispin's village settled into a new normalcy, forever altered by the revelations it had endured. Miss Marple continued her quiet observations, her knitting needles continuing their patient work, secure in the knowledge that human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, would continue to provide endless material for study and contemplation.